Monica Cementilli. It was a crisp January afternoon in 2017 when one of Los Angeles's most shocking betrayals unfolded in the affluent neighborhood of Woodland Hills. The sun cast a golden glow over manicured lawns, Spanish-tiled rooftops, and the winding streets lined with palm trees. But behind the doors of a luxurious home, a chilling truth was about to emerge: that love, trust, and companionship could all be shattered with a single act of orchestrated violence. The victim? Fabio Cementilli, a beloved celebrity hairstylist known in the beauty industry for his artistry and warmth. He wasn't just a stylist, he was a mentor, a family man, a man whose name carried respect worldwide. And yet, his life ended not at the hands of a stranger, but in a conspiracy led by the woman who vowed to stand by him forever: his wife, Monica Cementilli. What if I told you the face of betrayal doesn't always wear malice, but sometimes wears a smile? That the person lying beside you at night could already be planning your death while whispering words of love? Fabio was ambushed outside his Woodland Hills home. Stabbed repeatedly in a savage attack, his blood spilled across the driveway where his Porsche once gleamed. At first glance, it looked like a robbery gone wrong. The luxury car was missing, his wallet gone. Detectives followed the trail, initially convinced this was just another tragedy in a city plagued by opportunistic crime. But grief has a language, and Monica's sorrow seemed rehearsed, polished, almost like an actress auditioning for a role. Investigators, seasoned in the art of detecting lies, felt something was off. And when detectives peeled back the layers of her life, a darker story began to take shape. Monica was living in a marriage that, to the outside world, looked perfect. But beneath the surface, there were fractures, financial strains, desires for freedom, and above all, greed. The insurance policies on Fabio's life amounted to millions. A fortune, if only he were gone. Prosecutors later described Monica as a spider spinning her web. She didn't plunge the knife herself. Instead, she used her charm, her influence, and her cold ambition to lure others into her deadly plan. The men who carried out the attack were her pawns, puppets pulled by strings she carefully manipulated. To her, Fabio wasn't a husband. He was a means to an end. The investigation was slow and grueling, but persistence won out. Detectives connected the dots, uncovering the financial motives in the hidden relationships that tied Monica to the killers. By 2025, after years of mounting evidence, failed appeals, and delays, Monica Cementilli stood trial. And in that courtroom, her mask finally cracked. Witnesses painted her as a woman who lived two lives: the grieving widow in public and the calculating architect of murder behind closed doors. Her own children, devastated by the truth, watched as the mother they once trusted was exposed as a manipulator who put wealth above family. When the sentence was finally delivered, life in prison without parole, the courtroom felt a mixture of relief and bitterness. Justice was served, but no sentence could erase the horror of a betrayal so deep. Now, Monica lives behind concrete walls, far from the glamorous life she once flaunted. Her world reduced to prison bars, lifeless routines, and the heavy silence of regret. But the question lingers: does she regret her actions, or does she regret being caught? Fabio's legacy lives on in the students he mentored, in the friends who still speak his name with reverence, in the family members who fight to preserve his memory. Monica's legacy, however, is one of greed, deception, and eternal disgrace. This story reminds us of a terrifying truth. Sometimes evil isn't the shadow outside your window. Sometimes it's the person kissing you goodnight. But if betrayal by a spouse was chilling, what follows is worse. because the next killer didn't orchestrate the death of a partner for money. She brought unimaginable torture upon her own child. Pearl Fernandez Palmdale, California, 2013, a desert town known more for its quiet suburbs than for national headlines. But in February of that year, police responded to a call that would expose a crime so horrific, so gut-wrenching, that it would shake the entire country and force people to question how such evil could hide in plain sight. The victim was Gabriel Fernandez, an innocent 8-year-old boy, wide-eyed, gentle, and desperate for love. But instead of finding safety in the arms of his mother, Gabriel found himself trapped in a house of horrors, living under the rule of Pearl Fernandez and her boyfriend, Isauro Aguirre. Imagine this: your first teacher, your first safe space outside of home. Gabriel's teachers were among the first to notice the bruises, the injuries, the way his fragile body told a story he couldn't fully speak. Reports were made to social services, again and again. But each time, the system failed, and Gabriel was returned to the very woman who was torturing him. Pearl Fernandez wasn't negligent. She was sadistic. She forced Gabriel to eat spoiled food, locked him in a tiny cupboard where he spent nights shivering, shot him with BB guns, beat him until his ribs broke. Sometimes she made him wear girls' clothes as a form of humiliation. This wasn't punishment. This wasn't discipline. It was torture. And through it all, Gabriel still wanted her love. That's the most haunting part. Despite the abuse, he still wrote notes to his mother, telling her he loved her, pleading for her approval. But Pearl, cold and detached, offered only cruelty in return. On May 22, 2013, Gabriel's suffering finally ended. He was found unresponsive, his small body battered beyond recognition. Doctors at the hospital described injuries consistent with prolonged abuse, injuries no child should ever endure. The trial that followed captured the world's attention. Prosecutors labeled Pearl Fernandez a monster unworthy of motherhood. Her defense tried to paint her as a victim of her own abusive past, a broken woman unable to cope with life. But the evidence was undeniable. Gabriel's death was the result of deliberate, sustained torture. Pearl pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and the special circumstance of torture. By doing so, she avoided the death penalty. But her sentence, life without the possibility of parole, ensured she would never walk free again. During sentencing, the courtroom heard Gabriel's voice through the stories of teachers, neighbors, and relatives who tried to save him. His memory stood as a haunting reminder of how many times the system looked away. Pearl now lives in prison, serving a life sentence. But her name has become a symbol, not of justice, but of systemic failure. Gabriel's story sparked outrage, documentaries, and widespread reforms to California's child protection system. His short life changed laws, changed policies, and forced people to confront the darkest corners of human cruelty. And Pearl, she will die behind bars, forever branded as the mother who destroyed her own son. For many, her punishment can never equal her crime. Because some betrayals cut too deep, some evils are too absolute. Catherine Q., July 11th, 2011. A sweltering summer evening in Orange County. Behind the manicured lawns and pristine facades of middle-class America, a sinister plot was already in motion. Catherine Q., a 48-year-old woman whose life appeared ordinary from the outside, was about to commit an act that would forever change how we think about domestic violence and revenge. The evening began like any other. Her husband returned home from work, expecting the familiar routine of dinner and conversation. But Catherine had other plans. She had prepared his favorite meal, lacing it carefully with Ambien, enough to render him completely helpless. As he ate, trusting and unsuspecting, the powerful sedative began coursing through his bloodstream. What drove Catherine to this moment of unthinkable violence? The answer lay in a single, devastating piece of paper: divorce documents. Her husband had filed to end their marriage, a betrayal that Catherine couldn't accept. In her twisted mind, if she couldn't have him completely, then no other woman ever would. As her husband's eyes grew heavy and his speech began to slur, Catherine watched with cold calculation. When he finally collapsed into unconsciousness, she began the most horrifying phase of her plan. With methodical precision, she bound his wrists and ankles to their bed with rope, ensuring he couldn't escape what was coming next. But Catherine wasn't finished. In a moment that defies comprehension, she retrieved a large kitchen knife from their drawer, the same knife she had used countless times to prepare family meals. What happened next would be seared into the memory of everyone who heard this case. When her husband began to regain consciousness, groggy and confused, he found himself completely immobilized. The terror in his eyes as he realized his predicament was beyond imagination. But Catherine showed no mercy, no hesitation. In one swift, deliberate motion, she severed his penis with the kitchen knife. The victim's screams pierced the night air. But Catherine wasn't done with her revenge. In a final act of cruelty that demonstrated the depths of her rage, she took the severed organ and disposed of it in the garbage disposal, grinding it beyond recognition. She then calmly called 911, telling dispatchers that her husband had been injured in an accident. When paramedics arrived at the scene, they were met with a horror show. The victim, barely conscious from blood loss and shock, was rushed to the hospital where doctors fought desperately to save his life. Meanwhile, Catherine maintained her composure, initially claiming she had acted in self-defense. But investigators weren't buying her story. The evidence told a different tale, one of premeditation, of calculated revenge. The rope bindings, the drugged food, the methodical nature of the attack, everything pointed to a woman who had planned this mutilation down to the last detail. During the investigation, a chilling picture emerged of Catherine's state of mind. Friends and neighbors described her as increasingly unstable in the weeks leading up to the attack. She had made disturbing comments about what happens to men who abandon their wives, statements that now carried a prophetic weight. The trial that followed would captivate the nation. Prosecutors painted Catherine as a woman consumed by rage, someone who couldn't accept rejection and chose the most emasculating form of revenge possible. They argued that her actions weren't just an assault. They were torture, pure and simple. Catherine's defense team attempted to portray her as a victim herself, claiming years of emotional abuse had driven her to a breaking point. But the premeditated nature of her actions, the careful planning, the cold calculation, none of it supported a crime of passion defense. On the witness stand, Catherine showed little remorse. Her flat, emotionless demeanor as she described the events of that night chilled everyone in the courtroom. Here was a woman who had destroyed a life and felt justified in doing so. In 2013, justice finally caught up with Catherine Kiyou. She was convicted on charges of torture and aggravated mayhem, crimes that carried the weight of her heinous actions. The judge, clearly disturbed by the nature of her crimes, sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole. Manling Tsang Williams, August 7, 2007. The sun was setting over the San Gabriel Valley, casting long shadows across the manicured neighborhoods where families felt safe, where children played without fear. But inside one seemingly perfect home, A storm of violence was about to erupt that would shatter 3 innocent lives and leave a community reeling in disbelief. Manling Chong Williams appeared to have everything: a successful husband, 2 beautiful children, and a comfortable life in one of California's most desirable areas. But beneath the surface of this American dream, something dark was festering. Financial pressures, marital discord, and personal demons were combining to create a perfect storm of rage and desperation. That evening, as her husband Neil returned home from work, Manling was waiting. But this wasn't the loving wife and mother her family knew. This was a woman who had already made an unthinkable decision. If she couldn't have the life she wanted, then no one in her family would have any life at all. What happened next would become one of the most savage family annihilations in California history. Manling had armed herself with a samurai sword, a weapon that would become the instrument of unspeakable horror. As Neil entered their home, expecting the familiar comfort of family dinner and evening routines, he walked directly into his wife's trap. The attack began without warning. Manling struck her husband with the sword, but Neil was a fighter. He tried to defend himself, tried to reason with the woman he loved. But Manling was beyond reason. She stabbed him again and again, each blow driven by a fury that seemed to have no end. The medical examiner would later count over 90 stab wounds on Neil's body, evidence of a frenzied attack that went far beyond what was needed to kill. This wasn't just murder, this was obliteration. Manling had literally hacked her husband to pieces, transforming their family home into a slaughterhouse. But the horror was far from over. As Neil lay dying, his blood spreading across the floor where his children played, those same children were awakening to the sounds of violence. 7-year-old Devin and 3-year-old Ian Williams had no idea that their mother had just committed an act of unprecedented brutality. What kind of monster turns on her own children? What kind of mother looks into the innocent eyes of her babies and chooses murder? These questions would haunt everyone who learned about this case, because what Manling did next defied every instinct of maternal protection. Devin and Ian, confused and frightened by the chaos, sought comfort from the one person they trusted most, their mother. Instead of protection, they found death. Manling, still covered in their father's blood, made another horrific decision. She couldn't leave witnesses to her crime, not even her own children, using pillows from their own beds, the same pillows where they lay their heads each night in safety. Manling smothered both boys. 3-year-old Ian, barely more than a baby, struggled against his mother's hands as she pressed the pillow over his face. 7-year-old Devin, old enough to understand what was happening, must have experienced terror beyond imagination as his own mother murdered him. The children's deaths were slower, more intimate than their father's. Manling had to look into their eyes as she killed them, had to hold them down as they fought for breath. This wasn't a moment of rage. This was cold, calculated infanticide. When the killing was finally over, Manling found herself alone in a house of horrors. Her husband's mutilated body lay in a pool of blood, and her children's lifeless forms were still warm in their beds. The family she had created, the lives she had nurtured, were now nothing but crime scene evidence. But instead of feeling remorse, instead of calling for help, Manling attempted to cover up her crimes. She tried to clean the scene, tried to create a story that would explain away the carnage. When that failed, she attempted suicide, not out of grief for what she had done, but because she couldn't face the consequences. When police finally arrived at the Rowland Heights home, they encountered a scene that veteran investigators described as one of the worst they had ever witnessed. The sheer brutality of Neil's murder, combined with the calculated murder of two innocent children, created a crime scene that would forever be burned into their memories. During the investigation, a disturbing picture emerged of Manling's mental state. Financial troubles had been mounting, and her marriage was under strain. But thousands of families face similar pressures without resorting to mass murder. What made Manling different was her complete inability to accept responsibility or find another solution. The trial that followed would expose the depths of Manling's selfishness and cruelty. Prosecutors argued that she had committed these murders not in a moment of madness, but as a calculated decision to destroy her family rather than lose them through divorce or financial ruin. Manling's defense team tried desperately to find mitigating factors. But how do you explain away the murder of children? How do you justify a mother who smothered her own babies? The evidence was overwhelming, the brutality undeniable. In 2012, justice was finally served. Manling Tsang Williams was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The jury, horrified by the evidence they had seen, recommended the ultimate punishment. She was sentenced to death, joining California's death row where she awaits her fate. Jennifer DeLeon, Newport Beach. Known for its glittering coastline, million-dollar yachts, and sunsets that shimmer across the Pacific. But beneath that postcard-perfect paradise lurked a nightmare, a crime so cold-blooded it would stain the waters forever. The year was 2004, and Tom and Jackie Hawks, a couple in their 50s, seasoned travelers, deeply in love, were living their dream aboard a yacht they had named Well-Deserved. But little did they know, their dream would become a death sentence. And the woman who helped seal their fate was Jennifer DeLeon. What if I told you that evil can come wrapped in charm, with a smile so disarming that victims welcome it aboard their sanctuary? That's exactly how Jennifer and her husband, Skylar DeLeon, ensnared the Hawks. Tom and Jackie weren't reckless. They were cautious, careful, the kind of people who double-checked every deal. But when the DeLeons showed interest in buying their yacht, Tom and Jackie saw a young family trying to start fresh, a couple with a baby on the way. Jennifer, soft-spoken and seemingly sweet, played the part of the devoted wife. Her presence put the Hawks at ease. After all, what threat could a woman pose when she was rocking a stroller and talking about motherhood? But this was all theater, a con as sinister as it was convincing. On November 15, 2004, the Hawks invited the DeLeons and an accomplice aboard for a test sail. It was supposed to be routine. Instead, it became their last voyage. Out on the open water, far from prying eyes, the trap was sprung. Tom and Jackie were ambushed, tied to an anchor, and forced to sign documents transferring ownership of their yacht. The final act of terror? They were thrown overboard, alive, and drowned in the cold, unforgiving sea. Jennifer's role in the crime was chilling, not because she wielded the weapon, but because she wielded trust. She was the bait, the reassuring smile that lowered the Hawks' defenses. Without her, the plan might never have worked. When investigators began piecing the crime together, suspicion quickly circled back to the DeLeons. Skylar's history of fraud and failed acting stints painted him as a desperate man. But Jennifer? She was the puzzle piece that shocked everyone. The mother, the young wife, the woman people thought couldn't possibly have been part of such savagery. But phone records, witness testimony, and financial evidence told a different story. Jennifer was no innocent bystander. She was complicit from start to finish. And when she stood trial, prosecutors painted her as the silent partner in a murderous plot fueled by greed. The jury agreed. Jennifer DeLeon was convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without parole. Today, she sits in prison, her once ordinary life reduced to an eternity behind bars. And while her husband Skyler later met a different fate, condemned to death row, Jennifer will live out her days haunted by the screams of Tom and Jackie Hawks, the couple whose kindness she betrayed on the open sea. The ocean keeps its secrets, but this story reminds us that not every killer needs a weapon in hand. Sometimes, the deadliest role in a murder is simply being the face of trust. Larissa Schuster Clovis, California, a quiet suburban town where neighbors trim their lawns and wave politely at one another. It's the kind of place where evil feels impossible. But in July 2003, evil wasn't just possible. It was brewing inside the mind of Larissa Schuster, a biochemist with a dark obsession. Larissa wasn't a stranger to science. She spent her days in labs, surrounded by beakers, acids, and compounds most of us can't pronounce. To her, chemicals were tools. But one day, she would weaponize them in a way that stunned even veteran homicide detectives. The target of her rage? Her estranged husband, Timothy Schuster. By all accounts, Timothy was a gentle soul, a devoted father, a man who simply wanted peace after a crumbling marriage. But Larissa wasn't ready to let him go. Divorce wasn't enough. She wanted control, revenge, and ultimately, she wanted him erased. What if the very science you mastered became the instrument of your cruelty? That was Larissa's weapon of choice. On July 10, 2003, Larissa and her accomplice lured Timothy into a trap. He was beaten, restrained, and stuffed into a chemical barrel. But the horror didn't stop there. Instead of a quick death, Larissa ensured a slow, torturous end. She submerged him alive in hydrochloric acid, a substance so corrosive it strips flesh from bone. Imagine the terror, the suffocating fumes, the burning pain, the realization that the woman you once loved was dissolving you alive. Detectives who later uncovered the barrel described the scene as one of the most gruesome in California's history. Even seasoned forensic experts recoiled at what remained. For years, Larissa presented herself as a scorned wife, painting Timothy as the villain. But evidence spoke louder. Witnesses testified to her threats, her obsession with punishing Timothy, and her careful planning. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditated murder, executed with scientific precision. The trial was a media storm. Prosecutors didn't hold back, labeling Larissa a cold-blooded killer who weaponized her expertise for the darkest of purposes. The defense tried to humanize her, pointing to stress and emotional instability. But the jury saw through it. In 2008, Larissa Schuster was convicted of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of torture. The sentence? Life in prison without parole. Behind prison walls, the so-called acid widow has all the time in the world to reflect on her monstrous act. But reflection doesn't undo the crime. Timothy's life was brutally cut short. His daughter left to grapple with the unimaginable reality that her mother killed her father. And perhaps the most haunting part? Larissa wasn't a criminal by necessity. She wasn't desperate, destitute, or cornered. She was educated, intelligent, and fully capable of choosing a different path. Instead, she chose acid and agony. The lesson from Larissa's story is chilling. Intelligence without empathy can be a weapon deadlier than any gun or knife. Science, in the wrong hands, becomes horror. Kristen Rossum. The year 2000 was supposed to be a fresh start for Kristen Rossum. At just 25 years old, she had already carved out an impressive career as a toxicologist with the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office. Her job was to analyze blood and tissue samples, to determine what substances had killed the victims brought to her lab. She was trained to detect the undetectable, to find traces of poison where others saw only mysterious death. But Kristen harbored dark secrets beneath her professional exterior. Her marriage to Greg DeVillers was crumbling under the weight of her drug addiction and infidelity. Greg, a kind and trusting man who worked in biotechnology, had tried everything to save their relationship. He had supported her through rehab, forgiven her affairs, and believed in her promises to change. What he didn't know was that his wife was planning the ultimate betrayal. By late 2000, Kristen had fallen deeply in love with her colleague, Lloyd Amborn, a deputy medical examiner. Their affair wasn't just passionate, it was consuming. Kristen saw Lloyd as her ticket to a new life, but there was one obstacle standing in her way: her husband. Divorce would mean financial complications, potential career damage, and messy emotional confrontations. For someone with Kristen's scientific mind, there had to be a cleaner solution. November 6, 2000, started like any ordinary Monday in their Tierra Santa apartment. Greg prepared for another day at work, unaware that his wife had already decided this would be his last. Kristen watched him with the cold calculation of a predator, knowing that within hours, her problem would be permanently solved. The weapon Kristen chose was as elegant as it was deadly: fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times more potent than heroin. As a toxicologist, she had easy access to this controlled substance. And more importantly, she knew exactly how much would kill without leaving obvious traces. It was the perfect poison for someone who understood the science of death. But Kristen's plan went beyond simple murder. She was orchestrating an elaborate deception. That evening, she called 911 in apparent hysteria, reporting that she had found her husband unconscious in their bedroom. When paramedics arrived, they found Greg DeVillers lying peacefully on their bed, surrounded by scattered rose petals. The romantic scene seemed to suggest a loving husband who had surprised his wife, only to suffer some tragic medical emergency. "He's not breathing!" Kristen screamed to the paramedics, playing the role of the devastated wife to perfection. Her performance was so convincing that responders initially treated this as a natural death. Greg was young, healthy, with no obvious signs of trauma. The rose petals seemed to tell a story of romance, not murder. At the hospital, doctors worked frantically to save Greg's life, but it was already too late. The fentanyl Kristen had administered was coursing through his system, shutting down his respiratory system with methodical efficiency. Within hours, Greg DeVillers was pronounced dead, leaving behind a grieving widow who seemed inconsolable with grief. But Kristen had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated her own colleagues. The very people she worked with every day, the investigators and toxicologists who specialized in detecting hidden murders, began to notice inconsistencies in her story. Why were there rose petals scattered around a man who had supposedly collapsed from natural causes? Why did Christine seem more concerned about removing evidence from the scene than grieving for her husband? The investigation that followed would expose not just a murder, but a web of deception that revealed Kristen's true character. Detectives discovered her affair with Lloyd Amborn, her history of drug abuse, and most damning of all, her access to the exact poison that killed her husband. They also found evidence that she had been stealing drugs from the medical examiner's office, not just for personal use, but apparently for her deadly plot. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered Kristen's methodical planning. She had researched the perfect dose, timing her husband's death for maximum alibi potential. She had even staged the romantic scene with rose petals to deflect suspicion, knowing that investigators would be looking for signs of struggle or obvious murder weapons. During questioning, Kristen maintained her innocence with the same scientific precision she brought to her work. She had answers for every inconsistency, explanations for every piece of evidence. But her colleagues knew her too well. They recognized the cold calculation behind her emotional facade, the way she discussed her husband's death with the detachment of someone analyzing a lab specimen. The trial that followed was a battle between science and deception. Prosecutors used Kristen's own expertise against her, showing how her knowledge of toxicology had made her the perfect killer. They demonstrated how she had used her position to access fentanyl, how she had calculated the precise dose needed to kill without leaving obvious evidence, and how she had manipulated the crime scene to suggest natural death. Kristen's defense team tried to paint her as a grieving widow whose drug addiction had impaired her judgment, but the evidence was overwhelming. The premeditation was clear, the method was sophisticated, and the motive was undeniable. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was cold-blooded murder committed by someone who thought her scientific knowledge made her untouchable. The jury saw through Kristen's performance. They recognized that she had used her position of trust, her scientific expertise, and her husband's love as weapons in a calculated murder. In 2002, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Angelina Rodriguez, September 2000. Angelina Rodriguez seemed to embody everything pure about American family life. At 34, she was a dedicated preschool teacher who spent her days caring for other people's children, nurturing their growth and protecting their innocence. Her students loved her, parents trusted her, and her husband, Jose Francisco Rodriguez, believed he had married an angel. But beneath this carefully constructed image, Angelina was harboring a secret that would soon destroy everything. Money problems had been plaguing the Rodriguez household for months. Bills were piling up, creditor calls were becoming more frequent, and Angelina's teacher salary wasn't enough to maintain the lifestyle she craved. But rather than face these financial realities or find legitimate solutions, Angelina's mind turned to something far more sinister. She had discovered that Jose carried a substantial life insurance policy, $250,000, that would solve all her problems if only he were out of the picture. The plan that began forming in Angelina's mind was as calculated as it was evil. She wouldn't use a gun or a knife, weapons that would leave obvious evidence and raise immediate suspicions. Instead, she would use nature itself as her accomplice. In the landscaping around their Montebello home grew oleander plants, beautiful flowering shrubs that most people admired for their aesthetic appeal. But Angelina knew something that many didn't. Oleander contains cardiac glycosides, natural compounds that are highly toxic to humans. For weeks, Angelina researched her deadly plan with the methodical precision of someone planning a complex lesson. She learned about oleander's effects on the human heart, how the toxins would cause irregular heartbeat, nausea, and eventually cardiac arrest. Most importantly, she discovered that oleander poisoning could mimic natural heart failure, especially in someone without obvious health problems. Jose, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of his wife's murderous intentions. He continued going to work each day, coming home to family dinners, and planning for their future together. When Angelina suggested he should drink more Gatorade to stay hydrated during his physically demanding job, he saw it as caring concern from a loving wife. He had no idea she was already calculating dosages and timing her attack. The preparation phase of Angelina's plan was chillingly domestic. In her own kitchen, using the same pots and strainers she used to prepare family meals, she began brewing her deadly concoction. She boiled oleander leaves and flowers, creating a concentrated extract that she would later mix into Jose's favorite drink. The irony was horrifying. This woman, who spent her days teaching children about safety and care, was now creating a poison that would destroy her own family. On the day she chose to execute her plan, Angelina prepared Jose's Gatorade with the same casual efficiency she brought to making his lunch. The rare, bitter taste of the oleander extract was masked by the sports drink's artificial flavoring, and Jose consumed it without suspicion. Within hours, the cardiac glycosides were wreaking havoc on his cardiovascular system. Jose's death wasn't quick or painless. The oleander toxins caused his heart to beat irregularly, his breathing to become labored, and his body to convulse as his systems began shutting down. But even as he suffered, even as he called out for help, Angelina maintained her performance as the concerned wife. She called 911, rode with him to the hospital, and played the role of the devastated spouse watching her husband fight for his life. When Jose Francisco Rodriguez died at the hospital, doctors initially attributed his death to sudden cardiac arrest. He was young, but had been under stress, and heart attacks can strike anyone. Angelina's grief seemed genuine. Her shock appeared real, and there were no obvious signs of foul play. The insurance company processed her claim, and within weeks, she was $250,000 richer. But Angelina had underestimated the power of guilt and suspicion. Jose's family had never fully trusted his wife, and his sudden death struck them as convenient timing given the couple's known financial problems. They began asking questions, pushing for more thorough investigations, and refusing to let authorities close the case as a natural death. The investigation that followed would expose not just a murder, but a premeditated scheme that revealed Angelina's true character. Detectives discovered evidence of her financial desperation, her research into life insurance policies, and most damning of all, traces of oleander compounds in Jose's system. Forensic botanists were called in to analyze plant material found at the Rodriguez home, and toxicologists confirmed that the levels of cardiac glycosides in Jose's blood were consistent with deliberate poisoning. As investigators built their case, a disturbing picture emerged of Angelina's cold calculation. She had spent weeks perfecting her murder method, testing different concentrations, and timing the attack for maximum effectiveness. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a business transaction where her husband's life was exchanged for insurance money. The most chilling aspect of the investigation was discovering how Angelina had continued her normal life after the murder. She had returned to teaching preschool, continuing to care for children while having just murdered their father figure. Parents who had trusted her with their most precious possessions learned they had been placing their children in the hands of a killer. During questioning, Angelina maintained her innocence with the same patient demeanor she used with difficult students. She had explanations for every piece of evidence, alternative theories for every suspicious circumstance. But investigators could see through her performance. They recognized the calculated nature of her responses, the way she seemed more concerned about her story's consistency than about justice for her husband. The trial that followed captivated the community. Prosecutors painted Angelina as a woman so consumed by greed that she was willing to murder the man who loved her. They showed how she had used her knowledge as an educator to research poison, how she had exploited Jose's trust to administer the deadly drink, and how she had performed grief while secretly celebrating her financial windfall. Angelina's defense team tried to suggest that Jose's death was accidental, that perhaps he had somehow ingested oleander by mistake. But the evidence was overwhelming. The concentrated nature of the poison, the deliberate method of administration, and the obvious financial motive all pointed to premeditated murder. The jury saw through Angelina's facade. They recognized that this woman, who had dedicated her career to protecting children, had shown no mercy to her own husband. In 2004, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, joining California's death row, where she awaits her ultimate punishment. Socorro Cora Caro. It was the night of November 22, 1999, an evening meant for celebration. The anniversary of a marriage, a night when love and commitment should have been honored. But inside the quiet home in Santa Rosa Valley, California, that anniversary became the stage for a massacre so cold, so unthinkable, it still haunts the state to this day. Socorro Cora Caro was, to the outside world, a woman with the perfect family. 3 bright, beautiful sons, Xavier Jr., 11, Michael, 8, and Gabriel, just 5 years old. And a husband, Dr. Xavier Caro, a respected psychiatrist. They lived in a comfortable home, the picture of middle-class stability. But beneath the surface, their marriage was crumbling. Bitterness and resentment had taken root. And in Cora's mind, rage grew into obsession. On that night, as the rest of the world prepared for Thanksgiving, Cora loaded a handgun. Her children had already gone to bed, tucked into their rooms, their small bodies curled beneath blankets, safe in the illusion of a mother's protection. But safety was an illusion Cora herself would destroy. She walked first into Xavier Jr.'s room. He was just beginning to grow into adolescence, a boy with curiosity and ambition. Without hesitation, she raised the gun and pulled the trigger. Then she moved to Michael, her second son, only 8 years old, full of energy and joy. He too was silenced with a single, merciless shot. And then Gabriel, 5 years old, too young to even understand betrayal, too innocent to comprehend what was happening as the barrel turned toward him. He died where he slept, his small frame motionless beneath the covers. 3 children, 3 sons, gone in minutes. Cora spared her 4th child, the only survivor. But why? Was it mercy or was it calculation? Was it a twisted attempt at control? A way to inflict lifelong scars on both her husband and the surviving child? That question has never truly been answered. When Dr. Caro discovered the horror, his world collapsed. His sons, murdered by the very woman who brought them into the world. And on the day meant to mark their union, Cora had destroyed the family entirely. The trial that followed in 2002 painted a picture of a woman driven by vengeance. Prosecutors argued that Cora's motive was simple, yet monstrous. If her husband no longer wanted her, then he would no longer have their children either. It was not only murder, it was the annihilation of everything he loved most. The jury did not hesitate. Cora Caro was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. For such calculated cruelty, she was sentenced to death. But California's shifting policies on capital punishment altered her fate. Her death sentence was commuted, and instead she now serves 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Today, she sits behind bars, her name forever etched into the darkest chapters of California's criminal history. Her children never got the chance to grow, to live, to experience the future that was waiting for them. And she, once their mother, their protector, will never walk free again. Cora Caro's story is not one of madness in the moment. It is the story of premeditation, of cold-blooded betrayal, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not strangers lurking in the dark, but the ones who share our homes, our tables, our blood. Susan Eubanks. If Cora Caro's crime was unthinkable, what happened just 2 years earlier in San Marcos was even more unimaginable. October 26, 1997. A night when 4 children, brothers bound by blood, laughter, and innocence, became the victims of a massacre at the hands of their own mother. Her name was Susan Eubanks. At 33 years old, she had lived a turbulent life marked by toxic relationships, drugs, and instability. But nothing in her past could have prepared the world for the atrocity she would commit on that October evening. The day had begun with an argument. Susan's relationship with her boyfriend had collapsed into rage, and her anger boiled over. Fueled by alcohol, prescription pills, and a storm of violent emotions, she reached a decision so twisted it defies comprehension. She would kill not herself, but her children. That night, as the sun set over San Marcos, her 4 sons were at home. Brandon, 14, stood on the edge of adulthood, his life just beginning. Deanne, 13, was bright and spirited, a young teenager with a future ahead. Gregory, only 12, was still in the tender years between childhood and adolescence. And the youngest, Matthew, just 7 years old, a boy who should have been dreaming about cartoons and playgrounds, not staring down the barrel of his mother's gun. One by one, Susan Eubanks led them to their deaths. She shot Brandon, then Deanne, then Gregory, and finally, Matthew. The sound of gunfire echoed through the house, drowning out any last pleas or prayers. When it was over, 4 bodies lay lifeless in their own home. But Susan wasn't finished. She turned the gun on herself, firing into her chest in a failed attempt at suicide. She survived, and when the police arrived, they found a scene so chilling it left even seasoned investigators shaken. 4 dead children, executed in cold blood by their mother. The trial that followed in 1999 became one of the most emotionally charged in California history. Prosecutors argued that Susan's actions were deliberate and fueled by spite, her way of lashing out at her boyfriend, punishing him by destroying the lives of the children they were meant to raise. The defense painted her as a woman spiraling under depression, intoxication, and despair. But no amount of excuses could erase the reality of what she had done. The jury returned a verdict of guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder. And unlike Cora Caro, Susan Eubanks did not receive a commuted sentence. She was sentenced to death. Today, she resides on death row at the Central California Women's Facility, awaiting a fate the state itself struggles to carry out. For the families left behind, the pain never fades. Grandparents buried their grandchildren. Entire communities grappled with the question no one could answer. How could a mother, someone entrusted with love and protection, become the executioner of her own flesh and blood? Susan's story, like Cora's, is a chilling reminder that evil does not always come wearing a mask, hiding in shadows. Sometimes it lives in the very heart of a home, disguised as love until the night it turns into horror.